There have been many great broadcasters in auto racing history, but some have a greater stamp on their profession than others. One such legend is Ken Squier. For many reasons, Ken played an incredibly huge role in the growth of NASCAR from a southern spectacle to a national wonder. I'd argue that no one on the non-competition side of stock car racing helped grow the sport more than Ken Squier, other than Bill France Sr. and Jr. It's one thing to be a great commentator, but Squier did more than just that. Ken Squier was born on April 10, 1935 in Waterbury, Vermont. He grew up in a family that was passionate about motorsports, and his father Lloyd owned a local radio station. Naturally, these two passions came together. Ken's love for racing and broadcasting led him to start his career as a motorsports announcer at the young age of 14, traveling around the bustling Vermont short track scene. Despite stock car racing being a southern thing, this New Englander really started to make a mark locally. Working for his father's radio station and being involved in the business aspect led him to grow his outreach even further, and by 1960 he had opened a quarter-mile track in Vermont by the name of Thunder Road, which is now a longtime staple of the New England stock car scene. Being an expert radio host, broadcaster, and track owner led him to become one of the preeminent stock car figures in the region. By the early 1970s, NASCAR was about to enter its modern era, which meant higher payouts from Winston and a reduced schedule, emphasizing each race more than the myriad of races that littered the schedule before then. Bill France Sr. recognized that NASCAR needed its own radio network to deliver their growing product to the entire country. So that year, Bill France and Ken Squier founded Motor Racing Network, or MRN. To say MRN left an indelible mark on NASCAR history would be an understatement. Pretty much any broadcaster we've had in our living rooms at some point worked for MRN. Squier, Mike Joy, Alan Bestwick, Eli Gold, Bob Jenkins, the list can go on and on. Being on radio forced these guys to develop a descriptive, intuitive style of commentating that served them well later on down the line. The growth of MRN showed that a national broadcast of a NASCAR race was more than feasible. The next frontier of at-home technology was the television. In TV's early days, most sporting events were chopped up into highlight packages and shown on programs like ABC's Wide World of Sports. One such network that did that was CBS, which happened to show many NASCAR highlights at the request of one of their employees by the name of Ken Squier. Just so happened to be a CBS broadcaster by the late 1970s, Squier got the idea that NASCAR's biggest race, the Daytona 500, deserved live flag-to-flag coverage. While shorter races had been shown flag-to-flag, no 500-mile crown jewel had. Even in 1979, the Indianapolis 500 was still being shown in a condensed highlight package later on that night. So for this pokey little southern sideshow called NASCAR to have their biggest event shown in its entirety was going to be a tough sell. After enough convincing, Squier got his wish, with CBS executives finally caving in and deciding to show the race, noticing the growth that NASCAR had been on. It was a slow growth, but it was growth nonetheless. However, Squier picking this particular Daytona 500 to show, rather than say 1978 or 1980 or any other 500 of the time, was like pouring rocket fuel all over NASCAR's upward trajectory. The story of the 1979 Daytona 500 is well known by any seasoned NASCAR fan at this point, and many others have already covered the facts around the race in greater detail. But for the race to nearly be postponed by rain, which would have been backbreaking, to have most of the East Coast being snowed in with nothing to do but watch TV, to turning into one of the greatest finishes ever, it was all very much an incredible stroke of luck for NASCAR and Ken Squier. The play by Squier to get the 500 shown live paid more dividends for NASCAR's future than any other singular event. As both technology and interest in stock car racing grew, just a few years after the 1979 Daytona 500, every Winston Cup race was shown flag to flag. In the 1980s and 1990s, Squier kept his role with CBS as their lead announcer for the Daytona 500. So many incredible moments and calls made by Squier and his booth partners like Ned Jarrett left their mark on legions of fans across the country. He also anchored Turner Sports coverage as well, becoming a voice you heard for nearly half the season. Man, looking back on it, NASCAR fans were really spoiled in those days. Week to week you'd either hear Ken Squier or Bob Jenkins with guys like Benny Parsons and Ned Jarrett. No wonder the sport exploded during this time. These guys had been involved for decades by the 90s, and their experiences in the pre-television days helped them to relate to newer fans that were enjoying the sport all the time in those days. After 1997, Squier became CBS's studio host, and Mike Joy took over the lap-by-lap duties for the Daytona 500. When the TV contracts went to Fox and NBC in 2001, Squier was Fox's studio host for their inaugural coverage of Speed Weeks, but did not make many more appearances as a commentator after that. However, when the Southern 500 returned to its traditional Labor Day weekend date in 2015, NBC trotted out a trio of Ken Squier, Ned Jarrett, and Dale Jarrett to call a portion of the race. As someone who was really too young to hear Ken and Ned in the booth, it was incredible to hear them be so sharp at that age and still provide a ton of value on what's going on in the race to both the hardcore and the newer fans. NBC continued this tradition through 2017, a race in which Squier called Eric Jones that Jones boy, which quickly became his new nickname. Nearly 70 years in broadcasting by that point, and Squier was still able to throw down one-liners and nicknames and had all the hallmarks of a memorable, legendary broadcaster. I've always been a fan of broadcasters in any sport that can come up with witty phrases, show enthusiasm, and still be informative without falling into cheesiness, and Ken Squier absolutely falls into that category. In 2018, he became the first broadcaster inducted in the NASCAR Hall of Fame, and there was no one more worthy of that honor. If it hadn't been for Ken Squier, the timeline of NASCAR history would have been drastically altered. I just want to take the opportunity to speak for anyone who enjoyed NASCAR at any point in their lives and say thank you to Ken Squier for truly dedicating his life to his passions and bringing generations of people along for the ride.
When the cars came on a Saturday or a Sunday, that was magic, and I couldn't imagine living without that. It was just the most wonderful thing in the world. I got hired by Bill France. He heard about me, and I went down to Daytona, and that was heaven. That was everything that a young man that really cared about motorsports could possibly want. They found more and more things for me to do, and at one point, France Sr. said, "We need our own network, and I think I'm going to make one." So he formed the Motor Racing Network, and I was the announcer. And we got 300 or 400 stations. It was great fun. They would all come to Daytona. Everybody went to Daytona in those days. I kept going back and saying, you know, you ought to come down because that race could really be made into something. That Daytona 500, because it's all American. Those cars, they're the cars that people have in their driveway.